So I'm just going to start very quick background to PACE and to Egin. Sorry for those of you who've been to several of these meetings, but it's good to have an introduction. So PACE, for those who don't know, stands for PACE, rather, Powys Action on the Climate Emergency. And it's an association of community groups and organisations in Powys who are helping their communities make the transition to a low carbon future. It's also open to individuals who are interested in working towards the low carbon future, either for themselves or within their communities. Egin, who co-sponsor this, is unlocking the collective power of communities in Wales to tackle climate change. Through Egin, community groups can access peer mentor support to take their first steps towards taking action on climate change and living more sustainably. Their main focus is on helping those who will be the most impacted by climate change, yet may often feel they're not part of the conversation around climate. So this week we are looking at domestic retrofit, and we have two speakers, Jeremy Brignall-Thorpe and Damon. And I can't remember, sorry, Damon, can't remember your surname. And I'm going to hand over to Jeremy to start, and then Damon will be chipping in as we go through. If possible, could you put questions into the chat, and we'll raise those at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Diana. So yes, welcome everyone, and thank you for coming to listen to this. So I'm going to share my screen now. Hold a second, and I will get that set up. Whoops. Right, can everyone see that? Whoops.
Yeah, that's fine.
It's just gone to the wrong screen. There we go, that's it. Right, okay, so yeah, my name's Jeremy Brignall-Thorpe, and with me is Damon Webb. We're both part of Retrofit Lead, which is a partnership of not-for-profit organisations in Wales that is looking to try and improve the advice that people get for doing domestic retrofit. And I'm a retrofit assessor, which is a sort of fairly low level of retrofit advice. Damon is a retrofit coordinator, which he has a lot more expertise than me in this, so he'll be coming in to help with some of the more technical bits of the commentary. But we're basically, I'm going to be running through domestic retrofit and talking a bit about the levels of the various types of support that people can get in Wales and Powys to proceed with retrofit in their properties, and then looking briefly at some of the main issues around retrofit that are proving to be slightly sort of contentious in the media, such as heat pumps and solid wall insulation. But to start with, I'm just going to be going through the support network. I'm trying to get, oh, that's it. There we go. So yeah, so what is retrofit? Just a bit of background here. In 2015, the government realised that retrofit was not really working very well, that it was happening in a very piecemeal fashion. There were people that were just doing one measure in a house without thinking what the consequences were for doing further measures. There were unintended consequences happening and so on, and the sector wasn't really working. And so they commissioned a report, this one here, Each Home Counts, to look at how they could improve the way that retrofit was delivered. And that basically took several years to come to a conclusion, and out of that came something called PAS 2035, which was a quality standard for how retrofit should be delivered. And the sort of basic idea of PAS 2035 is to try to look at take a whole house approach, rather than say, we'll just do this measure on its own and we'll do that measure on its own. It looks at what is the, take the building as a whole and says, what does need to be done to this property in its entirety that would get it to as low carbon as possible, and what is the the best sequence to do those measures so that you don't have these unintended consequences. You don't have one measure then getting in the way of another one. so that you end up with a better result, and you end up with the lowest carbon version for the lowest investment. So that's what PAS 2035 is. It's a system of, it's a quality standard for how retrofit should be carried out to reach as low carbon as possible. Associated with that, there was a PAS 2030 standard, which is a standard for that installers have to follow and to comply with, to make sure that they understand what they're doing and do work that is not going to have bad effects and so on. Because there were various things happening, for instance, in solid wall insulation where things hadn't been done properly, and it's to make sure that the proper systems are followed so that the results are what is intended. Damon, do you want to add anything to that? Have I missed anything out?
No, it sounded pretty comprehensive. I think, as you say, prior to PAS 2035 and to some extent, the retrofit industry is a bit of a wild west. That there are a lot of people out there trying to sell products, whether that's external wall insulation, internal wall insulation, air source heat pumps, etc., that aren't necessarily appropriate for the specific buildings that they're going on to. So yeah, PAS 2035 sets out the framework for the assessment of the building, and then, as Jeremy said, it goes into the whole house approach. So you'll be looking at, for instance, solid wall insulation, but alongside ventilation to help avoid unintended consequences. Yeah, PAS 2035 always also sets out the kind of process for retrofit and the qualifications needed for each of the individuals within the sort of advisory and management team within a PAS 2035 project. It's mainly applied to bigger sort of multi-unit, particularly public sector housing schemes, but it can be interpreted and used for individual dwellings as well, or certainly the principles can be.
And I suppose one thing to say here is that, in fact, the role of retrofit coordinator, which is what Damon is defined within PAS 2035. And the role of the retrofit coordinator is supposed to be the one person that actually takes an overall view of that property, is the advocate for the property owner to say, these are the things that are the right things to do, and to make sure that the installers then do things in the right way, rather than the sort of salesman led approach where you would get a salesman along and says, you need to have such and such. So the retrofit coordinator, the training they get is to try and make sure that the correct things are recommended and done in the right order.
Exactly. Yeah. It's this kind of semi-project management role, but it requires a bit of understanding of how individual buildings work, I guess.
Yeah. So that's the background to where we've got to at the moment with the PAS 2035 system, and a lot of that's driving a lot of the way the direction retrofit is traveling at the moment. So I'm going to go through now some of the sorts of support for retrofit, and PAS 2035 will come into play in a lot of these. So the first one here is Eco4, and again, in theory, Eco4. Well, let's start at the beginning. Eco4 is basically a grant fund that is paid for by a levy on electricity suppliers. The government said, in order to try and get retrofit moving a bit more, it would impose a levy on all of the big electricity suppliers. They have to put some money into a scheme that then goes into making housing more energy efficient. There is some element of means testing to it, but the means testing element is fairly light. But the figures down there, the household income will be around about £30,000. That is slightly variable depending on what the makeup of the household is. There needs to be an element of vulnerability. That means either young people or elderly people or people with chronic illness living in the house, and an EPC of D or lower in theory, but but in practice, it's hard to get anyone to do anything unless it's an E or lower. So that does mean that a very large proportion of houses in Paris certainly would qualify for Eco4. I mean, so it's not really a sort of fuel poverty scheme. I mean, I think we would almost certainly qualify, and I don't regard us as being in poverty. So it's available to a wide variety of people. Well, I'll go on to the various routes in a while, but just the measures that you'll generally get from Eco4 are, it's usually a fairly standard package of an air source heat pump, internal solid wall insulation, and PV panels. And there are two main routes to getting through to Eco, because a lot of installers have direct funding from the energy suppliers for this. It's in their interest to try and get as many clients as possible, and so there is quite a lot of hard selling going on direct from installers who will be doing mail shots and so on to try and get and sign people up, because every property they get signed up, they would get paid for by the energy supplier. So I'm sure most people here have had a dozen leaflets through their door trying to promote it. There is a second route, which is via Warm Wales, in that Warm Wales acts as a sort of triaging system, where if you go through what's called the EcoFlex via Warm Wales, then they have a list of installers that are to some extent vetted, and there's not a very strict vetting that's going on. It's only a fairly loose vetting, but they will then link you to an installer to do an Eco4 installation for you. So you can go through either of those two routes, and I would recommend the Warm Wales one as being slightly more a safe way to go. So going on to the pros and cons a bit, there is quite a lot of controversy about Eco4, and basically through Eco4, it's genuinely a grant-funded scheme. So you would be typically, the installation costs for what you would get through that would be probably 20 or 30 or even 40,000 pounds worth of kit that will be installed as part of this scheme. So it's extremely generous, and what you get is a lot of a lot of kit and value from the scheme. But you have to realize that it is a scheme where the agreement is directly from you as a client to the contractor. So if anything goes wrong with the scheme, then your only recourse is to go via the installer. And there have been a few problems of people having schemes that have got problems, leaks, or things not working properly. And it is proving sometimes quite difficult to get redress from the installer. So even though it's a free scheme, it's important to choose the right person to be doing the installation for you. And there are some people that are concerned that because the installers are basically just ticking a box to say they've done an installation here and they've done an installation there, they're not focusing so much on making sure that the design is correct for that property, and you may not get as good a quality installation as you would if you were commissioning something privately, I think is probably what might be said. And also that they are being sold slightly on the basis of maybe raising people's expectations too much, that they're being sold on the basis that you have a heat pump and some PV panels, and when you've had your Eco4 installation, your energy bills will be next to nothing. And that's really not the case. That with a heat pump, I will go into heat pumps a bit later, but the electricity costs for a heat pump can be quite high, and you would expect to be paying probably nearly as much for your electricity for the heat pump as you were paying before for oil or gas. So you do have to be careful that you will still have significant energy costs. So there's probably quite a lot of things that one could go into in more depth in Eco4, and where I'm quite willing to have that conversation if anyone wants to delve into it a bit more. Do you want to say anything more about Eco4, Damon, in terms of your experience of it?
Well, I haven't got a lot of direct experience of it, but there's obviously been some pretty terrible press about it in the last few weeks. I think something like 3940 Eco4 installers, particularly for solid wall insulation, have had their contracts suspended over the last few weeks for poor workmanship, and leading to unintended consequences like damp and mold, etc., etc. So it supposedly is regulated, I think, under PAS 2035, but there's obviously some kind of flaw, or has been some kind of flaw in the system, which has allowed poor workmanship and poor specification to happen over the course of the scheme. So yeah, and as Jeremy said, the responsibility for that, in theory, falls onto the contractor, but in terms of actually getting recompense for the contractors, I think that is also proving quite difficult in a lot of circumstances. But it seems to lack an independent assessment of what is required for that particular property, or particularly properties at the outset, which is key, as we said earlier, to a successful retrofit.
Yeah, and one of the things I think that is a problem with it is that we said before that the retrofit coordinator was a role that was encompassed within PAS 2035, and the retrofit coordinator had the task of taking an independent view of the property and deciding what was going to be appropriate and making sure that what was installed is the right thing for that property. But
yeah, I was just going to add, so that would be based on a thorough assessment by the retrofit assessor at the outset.
But the thing about the retrofit coordinator and the retrofit assessor is that it is within the legislation. It does allow the retrofit coordinator to be employed by the installer. The retrofit coordinator can be an independent person, and ideally that's what it would be. But the rules do allow that person to be employed by the installer. And if the retrofit, so Eco4 installers do have retrofit coordinators on their books that would, in theory, have done a recommendation at the start. But because that retrofit coordinator is employed by the installer that's going to be doing the work, there is obviously a conflict of interest in terms of making, or that coordinator coming up with something that isn't going to be expensive or difficult for the installer to put in place.
Yeah,
so
I was just going to add, the same goes for the retrofit designer who actually designs the system that goes onto the outside or inside of that building. So if they are not independent, then they're obviously likely to be biased towards that product, which may not be suitable.
So I think my overall recommendation for Eco4 is, if you're eligible for it, it's worth doing, but go into it quite carefully. Ask around and find an installer. Go by a personal recommendation from someone that has got a good report of a particular installer. Don't make the assumption that your energy bills are going to be very much lower than they are at the moment, because heat pumps can be quite expensive to run. And just go in with your eyes open and get independent advice from anyone to try and make sure that you know that you're going in, as I say, with your eyes open. It is good, a good scheme. Well, you're getting good value from the scheme as long as it's done properly. I mean, does that seem Damon, is that a sensible approach?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there will be some houses where internal or external wall insulation is not suitable at all, and there will be some houses where air source heat pumps are not going to be a cost-effective solution unless coupled with other measures, so e.g. insulation and improved ventilation. So yeah, things have to be done, assessed properly, and done in the right order and specified correctly.
So if someone is thinking of going for Eco4, I'm quite happy for them to contact me, and I can talk it through in more detail, so they make sure so you make sure you know what you're doing. I'm quite happy to do that. So I'll move on now from Eco4. Nest. I won't spend very much time on Nest because basically this is a sort of a scheme that runs in parallel to Eco4. The only difference is that Nest is funded by Welsh Government, whereas Eco4 is funded really by UK government with the levy on energy suppliers. But to some extent, they do much the same thing, and it can be confusing as to whether you should apply to one or the other. The best advice is that Warm Wales actually act as some sort of a triaging system. And if you go and talk to Warm Wales, they will point you at what they think is the most appropriate one for your circumstances. So my general advice is, if you want to apply to any of these, talk to Warm Wales, that's their website, and they will point you at the right direction for what is most appropriate for you. So the other scheme here, which we'll talk about briefly, is the boiler upgrade scheme. I mean, there's not a great deal to say here. It basically is a grant scheme operated by the UK government that currently offers a one-off grant of £7,500 for a heat pump or £5,000 for a biomass boiler. There's no means testing. It's available to anyone that wants to take it up. The only caveat to it, I'd say, is that for most properties, the fabric first approach is generally what most retrofit coordinators would encourage you to go down. So just replacing an oil boiler with a heat pump without looking at the insulation and ventilation as well, you're potentially going to end up with quite high energy bills. So I'd suggest that you do make sure that you look at doing insulation as well, rather than just replace with a heat pump. The fabric first approach basically says do insulation first and then replace with a heat pump when you've sorted all the insulation. So the fact that the government is specifically offering a grant scheme for heat pumps and not for insulation in the same way is not really the right way of doing it.
Yeah, as you say, I don't think there's any requirement for any kind of assessment as to suitability in the bus system at all, is there? So as you say, as Jeremy says, if you put an SOS heat pump in a leaky old 17th century house, then you're likely to end up with or potentially end up with a colder house and a bigger bill.
So anyway, the boiler upgrade scheme is available to anyone, and it would be you would get access to it via the installer. The installer would be the one that would apply for it and access that for you. Gone to Green Homes Wales now. This is a relatively new scheme for Wales. It was launched in October 2024, and it's a bit, well, it's a support scheme that covers the able to pay market as well as the less able to pay market. So Eco4 is means tested. Green Homes Wales is not means tested, and it's basically trying to make sure that those that aren't able to access Eco4 or any of the other schemes, or may not choose not to access Eco4, can get the best advice, and there are some small grants and loans attached to it as well. So basically the way the Green Homes Wales works is that you apply via the Development Bank of Wales, and I think that not everyone that applies necessarily gets through. There is a limited pot of funding there, and they look for people that it appears do seem to be wanting to actually go ahead with some interventions rather than just people wanting some advice and then not necessarily proceeding. So there is a filtering of applications that takes place, I understand. But then if you're successful, you would get a full past 2035 type report on your retrofit options to what would be appropriate for your property. And that would comprise a visit from a retrofit assessor, such as myself, and then a report written by a retrofit coordinator such as Damon. And we have to declare a conflict of interest here in that at the organisation I mentioned, Cartrefi Clyd, which is this partnership of not-for-profit organisations in Wales, are on the delivery framework for Development Bank of Wales, but there are others as well. But basically, you would get a survey of your property and an options assessment of of what would be the right retrofit measures, and that's done by a retrofit coordinator that is completely independent, because in most cases the retrofit coordinator would be independent of any installer. And then, should you wish to go ahead with any of that, there are some zero interest loans that you can then get through the scheme, and there are some small grants, partial grants, for going ahead with some of the measures. The grants, I think that they're various percentages, and they depend a bit on whether the scheme includes a heat pump or not. They still are quite keen to promote heat pumps. So if the measures include a heat pump, I think the measures are typically around about 30% grant funding. And if the measures don't include a heat pump, the grant is something like 15% of the capital funding, together with zero interest loans as well. But the fact that you've got an independent assessment of the right way forward for that property means that the measures should be the most appropriate ones for that property.
Yeah, so that assessment and report will cover the kind of existing fabric of the building and any issues with that fabric, sort of any sort of damp and water ingress issues. It will cover existing ventilation, windows, and the sort of overall fabric, and that assessment and judgments made on it will be reflected in the retrofit report, offering some usually a kind of shopping list of potential retrofit measures to the client that they will then pick and choose from. But then we will advise them on the correct ordering of those and some outline budget costings in the report.
So it does seem quite a good development, this. We're quite keen to see this has happened, because prior to this, there wasn't really any support for those that didn't want to go down the Eco4 or other routes. And this is providing the genuine independent advice to the able to pay owner occupiers in Wales. So yeah, go and have a look more at the website of the Development Bank of Wales.
Yeah, I'll just add to that now we're getting to the kind of costing and implementation phase of the Green Homes Wales schemes, that we're identifying a few issues with actually finding past 2030 registered contractors to actually do the work. So there's a bit of catching up that the actual construction industry and training of construction people needs to happen fairly swiftly, I think, because there is a lack of trained and registered past 2030 contractors in all areas, in all the trades.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. Yes, it's especially things like for wall insulation. There is definitely a lack of installers that are trained and capable of doing that we're trying to address. Okay, so the final support assistance. This is the zero interest loans available from the Robert Owen Community Bank. These have been around for quite a while now, for quite a few years, and they're supported by Powys Council. So it's a zero interest loan because the council, I think probably via some other grant funds they've got, they're not paying directly, but basically the interest and the administration of the loan is covered by external funding. So it's a genuine scheme, and the advantage of this is that it's actually very widely applicable to a whole variety of different technologies. So you're not limited to just a heat pump or wall insulation. It can fund, if it's associated with energy efficiency measure, then the criteria is quite broad. So, and I think that, yes, there are loans of up to about £12,000. I think it's repayment over 5 years, but that's done definitely worth looking into if you're looking to make any improvements, and it's not coming through a something like Eco4. So those are generally the ways that you can get assistance for retrofit. So we can probably take questions on those at the end. I'm going to move on now to just looking a bit more about some of the technologies involved. So we're just going to touch briefly on heat pumps, wall insulation, PVs and batteries, and ventilation, because those are some of the four aspects that are most important to consider when you're doing, or at least that have got some issues associated with them to do with retrofit. So I'm going to talk about heat pumps briefly to start with. And here we're actually going to have a little bit of a demonstration. So I'm going to turn the screen share off for the moment, because it seems that a lot of people find the concept of a heat pump quite difficult to understand how heat pumps work. And I did a little demonstration a month ago, and it seemed to sort of assist some people in understanding heat pumps. So I'm going to do the same again now. So the principle of a heat pump is that if anyone can remember from their O-level science, is that if you take a gas when it's compressed will get hot, and when it's decompressed, when it's stretched, it will get cold. So, and most people remember that from when you used to pump your bike tires up, that when you pump a bike tire up, the end of the pump will get quite warm because it is there is compressed gas in there. So basically, all a heat pump is, I can model a heat pump with a bicycle pump, because if I take a bike pump and I put my finger over the nozzle and I compress, then the end of the pump will get slightly warm from the compressed gas. And if I just wait a few minutes in the room, I'm in a room here, I'll wait a few minutes in the room, and that heat that's been generated by that gas will gradually dissipate and will warm the room up slightly with that small amount of heat. If I then carry this heat pump and walk outside with it, I won't do that because I'll go off camera. But if you imagine now that I'm walking outside with this into the garden, and then I pull the pump back out again, so I'm stretching the gas in here. And the same principle in reverse is that the gas then gets cold, it gets very cold, and when I'm outside, that cold, the ambient heat from outside will then warm up that gas back up to ambient temperature. So it will absorb some heat from the ambient air outside. So now I come back, I'm walking back into the house here, back into the room, and I compress the pump again, and that gas gets warm again, and that heat that it absorbed from the outside appears as heat in the compressed gas, which then dissipates into the room. So I'm gradually taking bits of heat from outside, it's absorbing heat from outside, cooling down the outside, and then I'm bringing that heat in and I'm re-releasing it into the house. So that's basically what a heat pump is doing. It is entirely, you can entirely replicate it with a bicycle pump, and obviously a heat pump works many times faster and more efficiently. But
So
you're not creating any heat, you're just transferring a bit of heat from outside to inside.
it's basically a fridge freezer in reverse, isn't it? I think, if I understand it correctly. And it's utilizing the difference in the temperature between the refrigerant, which could be down to -20, and the outside air temperature. That's where it's getting its heat from.
Yeah, so that's what a heat pump is, and it doesn't create heat, it just moves it from one place to another. So I'm just bring the screen share back up again. Right. Let's get us back to the slide we were on. So we're back on heat pumps. So yes, so a heat pump is a lot more efficient than a normal electric heater. With a normal electric heater, you would basically create from 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, you would get 1 kilowatt hour of heat. With a heat pump, you would generally get typically around 3 kilowatt hours of heat for each 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. But that that's called the coefficient of performance, that ratio between the amount of heat you get to the electricity you put in. That coefficient of performance can vary quite widely from anything between 2 to about up to 6 or so. So if you had a really efficient heat pump, you could potentially get 6 kilowatt hours of heat for each 1 kilowatt hour of electricity. And a lot of that difference in the performance depends on having the system designed really well. One of the things that is most critical to getting a good coefficient of performance is what's called the flow temperature, and that is the temperature at which the heat is delivered to your house through the radiators. Basically, the hotter you set the radiators to be running at, the poorer the efficiency of the heat pump. So with a good heat pump, you need the temperature of the radiators to be kept as low as possible, but just sufficient to maintain the comfortable temperature in the house. But no more than that. And that's why underfloor heating is very suitable for heat pumps, because underfloor heating tends to operate at a much lower temperature than radiators. So
yeah.
Go on, Damon.
I was just going to say, and also utilizes the thermal mass of your concrete floor and screed. So it's actually warming up the fabric of the building, which then radiates the heat out.
Yeah. So you've got the importance of the flow temperature. A good heat pump design should incorporate what's called weather compensation, which means that if the weather is fairly mild outside, then it realizes that you don't need as much delivered into the house, and therefore it can turn down the flow temperature proactively to improve the coefficient of performance even more when you don't need as much heat delivered into the house. And conversely, when it's very cold outside, it would turn up the flow temperature so that, but we would sacrifice a bit of efficiency doing that. So it's important to have things like weather compensation set up, so basically it's important to have good design. And so we talked about the coefficient of performance of typically being around 3. That is that for each 1 kilowatt hour of electricity, you would produce 3 kilowatt hours of heat. Now, the current electricity prices, the discrepancy between electricity and oil prices is that electricity is around about 36p a kilowatt hour at the moment, and oil is typically around about sort of 8 to 10, well, run at 8p a kilowatt hour at the moment. If you work out what how many kilowatt hours there are in a litre of oil, then it works out at around about 8p per kilowatt hour. So electricity is more than 3 times the cost of oil at the moment for the amount of energy that's in that oil or electricity. So with a coefficient of performance of 3, a heat pump is going to cost around about the same to run for per unit of heat that you deliver as an oil boiler at the moment. It's not going to be a cheaper option than an oil boiler. And that's what I think a lot of people don't quite understand. They assume that a heat pump is going to be very cheap. If you can manage to get your heat pump up to a coefficient of performance of 5 or 6, then it would become very much cheaper. But it is quite a challenge to get a heat pump to operate to that level of coefficient of performance. And if it's badly designed and it's only achieving a coefficient of performance of 2, then it's going to be quite a lot more expensive to run than an oil boiler. So this is emphasizing that the importance of good design and setting up the heat pump with the right settings to get a reasonable cost of heating. And
I'll just chip in and add that the higher COPs are generally achieved with ground source heat pumps rather than air source heat pumps. So they're a lot more expensive to install, and obviously you need land to put them in, but they do have a better COP generally.
Yeah, I think the general expectation is that electricity prices will rise slower than the rise in oil prices, so that although they probably are cost a similar amount to run at the moment, as oil prices rise, in a few years' time, it will definitely be the case that heat pumps will become cheaper to run. So it's a good long-term solution, and I would say that it is pretty well the only low-carbon solution. So over time, we are going to have to convert most of our properties in the UK to heat pumps, but we just need to do so understanding the importance of good design and that they still do use a significant amount of electricity. So we have to make sure that expectations are appropriate. Is there anything else we need to add about heat pumps? I mean, generally, I would support them.
You might have already said it, but I was just going to add that, I mean, typically a air source heat pump generates the water temperatures about 35 to 55 degrees. With a boiler, it's about 60 to 80 roughly, I think. So hence the need for, you're not necessarily going to run your ASHP off your existing radiators. So there's often a need to upgrade the whole of the heating system.
That's right, yes. So whenever, if you get a heat pump installed under Eco 4, they will replace all the radiators as well because of the need to put in larger radiators. And that's the more disruptive element of the process. The heat pump itself is fairly straightforward to put in, but the fact that you need to replace all the radiators.
I would also just reiterate the need to consider the whole house, and yeah, there's generally no point putting an ASHP in if you're not addressing the other measures.
Yeah. So that's a bit about heat pumps, and we can go back if anyone wants to ask more questions on those later. Wall insulation, there's quite a bit of focus now on solid walls and what is the most appropriate way of insulating solid walls. Past 2035 has focused quite a lot on the distinction between breathable and unbreathable, and that if they classify generally walls that are sort of pre-1900 as breathable, and for breathable walls, they past 2035 would say that you ought to put in a breathable insulation. Otherwise, you're going to get problems with condensation occurring in the wrong places and so on. And Damien may be able to expand on that a bit.
Yeah, I think
go on.
Yeah, I was just going to add anything before about 1919, 1920 is likely to be solid walled. So any solid walled, with very few exceptions, any solid wall building needs to have breathable insulation, whether on the inside or the outside, ideally on the outside.
But there's quite a lot of focus now on trying to avoid condensation and mold problems that occur with moisture behind panels and so on. So I think the thing to emphasize with wall insulation is that you do need to have an insulation system that's designed and appropriate for your walls. So it's no good just slapping on any insulation that seems as if it's going to add insulation value. That it comes back to the role of the understanding how the wall works and making sure the appropriate product is used, which is, I think, where past 2035 is coming in.
Yeah, and there will be installers and suppliers of materials that will try and sell you materials that aren't appropriate for your house. And quite often, if you do use those materials, the results, the unintended consequences won't show themselves for a couple of years. But so yeah, by which time the contractor will be long gone and you'll have paid them.
Just a brief word about the differences between internal and external insulation. The process of doing internal wall insulation and external is basically, they're both very similar. You just apply a batt of insulation to the wall and then either render or plaster over the top of it. Internal wall insulation is the one that is in some ways slightly easier to do because you don't have the same waterproofing problem, and therefore it's being done much more widespread. But in theory, external insulation is a superior solution because you don't have the same problem of cold bridging. Cold bridging is where there's a gap in the insulation where heat can still escape. For instance, if you're putting internal insulation into a house, you can't insulate the gap where the floor void between the ground floor and first floor occurs. So that bit won't be insulated and the heat will be leaking out there. And also where internal walls join external walls. So internal wall insulation inevitably will have cold bridges, whereas external insulation will more wrap around the whole building and will avoid cold bridges a bit more. So that's one reason why it's slightly superior. Another reason is that if you have external insulation, all of the masonry of the building is inside the insulation and adds to thermal mass, which helps to stabilize temperature and moisture as well. So it leads to a more stable atmosphere in the building. So for those reasons, technically external is a superior solution, but in many cases it's not practical either for aesthetic reasons or for other reasons, and internally is probably more widespread more widespread use at the moment.
I would just add that as a rule of thumb, internal insulation is about 10 times more likely to cause interstitial condensation than external wall insulation. That's a very, very rough rule of thumb. And with internal insulation, to help avoid condensation within the wall, you have to use a much thinner, you're limited to a much thinner thickness of insulation. So for instance, internal wall insulation would be 50, 60 mil. External, you could be up to 150 mil. Again, as a rule of thumb. There are exceptions to that, but.
So again, we can come back to questions on that later. We'll rattle through because I realise the time is pressing on. PVs and batteries. I think the only thing to say here is that a big fan of putting PVs. Quite often, it's the measure. If you've got a decent roof, it is the one that is going to be most effective in terms of cost effectiveness and carbon reduction effectiveness as well. Batteries are becoming very popular. I would say that with batteries, they are just about at the point of being viable. So you're not going to make enormous returns from it, but it will probably just about pay for itself. Bear in mind with batteries that they do have a finite life. The life will probably be not much longer than the guarantee that you're given with the batteries, which is usually about 10 years. And it is possible to do some fairly straightforward sums to work out whether what a battery is costing is going to be recoverable by savings you're going to make in your electricity. But in general, I would say PV is definitely often the first measure to put in as being cost effective, and batteries probably secondly so. But batteries, you can add them at any time and their costs are still falling. So it's difficult to know when the right time is always next year when the costs are a bit lower.
Yeah, perversely under past 2035, renewables are generally the last thing to be added and recommended. But I think I would agree with Jeremy on that one, that it's quite an easy win.
It does seem to be a bit sort of converse, doesn't it? That the reports will often put the PV down as one of the last things to put in, even though it's actually the most cost effective.
Yeah,
and it generally doesn't actually interfere with anything else you might be wanting to do with the property either.
yeah, I'd say it's a slight flaw in the fabric first approach, but a slight anomaly.
So that's on PV. Ventilation. This is getting much more focus under past 2035 because there had been a lot of the ventilation and condensation issues previously. I mean, Damon can probably talk more sensibly on this than myself. Do you want to add anything on that, Damon?
Well, just to say that, I mean, again, going back to older buildings, traditional buildings, they were designed, consciously designed to be fairly leaky and to have air movement within them. So a lot of our modern windows and plasters and external renders, cement renders, are basically sealing the buildings up. And so even without adding internal or external wall insulation, there are potential damp problems. But once you stick another layer on the outside or the inside, then you're exacerbating those problems. So any particularly internal or external wall insulation, you have to couple that with an assessment of the ventilation and in most cases, improve the ventilation. Also, just to add, under the new past 2035-2023 regs, they're also focused on air tightness, which is very appropriate for modern buildings, but much less appropriate and difficult and harder to achieve for traditional buildings, almost impossible to achieve. And not necessarily that desirable either.
Right. So the only other thing I was going to mention was in terms of promoting retrofit locally, the one thing that can be done is to run green open doors events, which have been run in various places around here in Paris and Shropshire. Basically, the opportunity to try and make people more familiar with retrofit. If you've got people that have done some retrofit in houses, then it's a way of introducing people to the what can be done. And the best way of promoting it is sort of peer-to-peer type people talking about their experiences. So if there are communities that want to try and promote that locally, then that's quite a good way to do so. So that's pretty well, that's the very quick gallop through some of the topics on retrofit. Very happy now to, I realise we haven't really stopped for questions going through this. I'm very happy to have any discussion about any of the things that have been raised, if anyone wants to come in on that point. Shall I stop